Hello and welcome to the staff discussion for Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler as part of our Black Lives Matter discussion series. Let's just all quickly introduce ourselves so people know who we are. My name is Marissa and I work in the outreach department and I will be facilitating today.
My name is Angie and I'm in the public and desk service department.
I'm Elizabeth and I work in the archives department.
My name's Audrey and I'm a production librarian.
I'm Lucy and I work in the youth department.
I'm Lauren and I'm a desk clerk.
I'm Sherlania, I'm an associate director.
So Parable of the Sower was first published in 1993. It's part of an unfinished series. It was supposed to be a trilogy, but only the first two books were published before her death. And in 2020, for the first time, it hit the New York Times paperback trade fiction list for the first time. So it's obviously very relevant still today. It takes place in the near future of the 2020s. Here we are. There's climate change and drought, economic collapse, food scarcity, a huge divide between the haves and the haves not. And this book kind of follows the journey of a woman named Lauren on her journey as a refugee, essentially moving north and looking for a new place to start after her community is destroyed. So my first thought for starting this is that most other apocalyptic dystopian books that I've read kind of start with a singular event that kind of causes everything to go bad. And this book focuses on just a lot of small things that add up over time and get worse and worse. And Lauren appears to kind of be the only one in her community who's kind of recognizing that things could get a lot worse. And nobody's really wants to hear that. So I was wondering what your thoughts were for like why people responded so badly to her warnings and how that is looking today in the actual 2020s when there is obviously a huge prepper industry marketing actual prepper supplies.
It is super relevant to today, isn't it? Like scarily so. And it's great that it's set in like what it starts in 2024, I think, or 5. But like her dad said, it was just kind of like they don't want to think about it until it's here. It's too scary to think about it all at once. So there's like the prepper people who are like, yeah, we got to plan ahead for this. And the other people who are kind of just like, I don't know if I can plan for that yet. It's too scary.
I also think that it's interesting you brought up the prepper industry because I feel like the prepper industry, there's almost like a hobbyism element to it. Like there's a fantasy element to it. You're preparing for like a very different future. And a lot of them, it's like also prepping to stay where you are, right? So it's like there's an element of like maintaining your space. I feel like I don't think that the prepper industry is necessarily like looking at the ways in which society might deteriorate to the point where it does in Lauren's society. So like what Lauren is looking at, I feel like is a little bit different than like what the prepper industry is looking at. And it is, I think it is hard to see the things that could like shake the foundation of your society, like even in like the small granular level, like the small community that she lives in. I know it's not the topic of what we're talking about, but in the second book, the same thing kind of happens to the society that she sets up at the end of this book. And she totally fails to see how to like predict that might happen. So I think it's a very human thing to resist change, to bring it back to kind of Parable of the Sower.
I think it's hard to imagine, like if you're already in a situation where it's worse than you ever imagined it, I think that it's extremely difficult to imagine like so much worse, right? Because like if things are already worse than you thought that they would be, for a lot of people, it's going to take up a lot of energy to even cope with what is, and to like open the door to a whole nother set of monsters you haven't yet imagined. I think it's super hard, and I think that in some ways that can be looked at as people like trying to protect themselves mentally. And maybe people don't feel like they even can do anything about it, right? So like if you feel like you can't do anything about it physically, or like you can't set up a new society, which is a big thing to think that you're capable of, maybe then like closing your eyes is like the last protection that you have, even if you're not thinking about that explicitly.
I think Audrey kind of mentioned like prepping is something of a fantasy. So it's an event that you kind of accept could potentially happen, but you don't ever think it will. And I think that kind of came to a front like with COVID, because all the people who had prepped for a disaster, then not all of them, some of them were like, this isn't a disaster though. This isn't the disaster that I've been prepping for. So it's like, you just keep waiting for something worse, like Shalanya said.
I think that's the thing with like the prepping too is, or preparing for any kind of disasters, you're controlling the narrative when you're the one prepping for it. So like you're saying, Elizabeth, well, this isn't the one I was waiting for, because that's not really the story I've been telling myself in my mind. And so then another way to control that is to just close your eyes and not spend the mental energy on it, like you said, Shalanya. So
There's also, I think her dad called it looking into the abyss, where she wants to like teach other people in the community, and he's like, yeah, teaching is good, it gives people something to do, but don't let people look into the abyss that the adults have been doing that for so long, balancing on the edge of like despair and kind of giving into despair, where we even gave it a word right over quarantine of like doom scrolling, of kind of just like hours and hours looking at social media and just kind of like giving into hopelessness. So I think like denial and hopelessness kind of weirdly go together in some ways.
Yeah, I found the relationship between Lauren and her father, who's a pastor and clearly a community leader in their community, very interesting, because you just mentioned like looking into the abyss, and how, clearly Lauren has a lot of respect for her father, and yet she pushes her father, and she's clearly wanting to be more prepared for what comes next for their community, than he's willing to acknowledge. And he almost gives her advice at one point, saying like, you can't look into the abyss, you can't do it your way, you need to go about it in a particular way, otherwise people will be scared. It's kind of like what Shalani was talking about. It's just the fear is paralyzing for a lot of folks. I thought that it was interesting. I wonder if other people picked up on this from the book as well. It seems that that kind of short-sightedness is almost, Octavia Butler seems to be suggesting, generational in a lot of ways, not entirely, but the adults who have managed to sort of cobble together this secure ish neighborhood, where they built this wall, right? They have security measures. They're not entirely self-sufficient, but they've got their group that they look after. It's almost, they often tell youngsters in the community, well, gosh, it's going to get better. Believe me, it used to be like this, and it's going to get back to this. You just wait. And Lauren and probably other young members of the community just see the writing on the wall and just go, yeah, no, it's nothing. The good times are not coming back. And so I wonder, like, if some of that short-sightedness is a bit like the yearning, the people who are older remember the time when you didn't have to, when you called the police, they actually showed up and they did something, or the fire department came and you didn't need to bribe them, or they, whatever. And that society has just collapsed. And the young people grew up knowing not to trust these institutions. Yeah.
Well, and the young people grew up inside that wall. you know, and like the I feel like that wall, you know, that wall that they're enclosed in is sort of like, that's as far as they can allow themselves to see, sort of a thing. And that's like all there is. And then the wall breaks. And then it's like, okay, this is like the rest of the story, sort of a thing. And like, that's sort of like a, I mean, probably a metaphor for like the short-sightedness of that plan. It's like, as long as we're in here, we're good. But we know there is something else that's coming, but this is all we can kind of think of, is like us within this wall and the borders of that.
Yeah, I definitely felt that just very viscerally, because there's a couple parts in the book where she pretty much explicitly says, like, older people, they change the climate of the world, but now they're just waiting for the old days to come back. And I just like, oh, yeah, it's hard to read. Hard to read. So Octavia Butler is such an interesting author, and for so many reasons. But one of the reasons that I like her a lot is she kind of plays with so many science fiction and fantasy conventions, or like tropes of the genre. I don't know how much people here read those particular genres, but I was wondering if there anything that kind of struck you as playing with those genres, something that you either did expect, that you did see, or that you just didn't see at all. Like for me, I mean, it's pretty explicit, where there's the company, Oliver or Oliver, however it's pronounced. They're coming to recruit for new employees. They're basically looking for like wage slaves to come and live, probably going to be paid very little, but they'll live in the city. And she says, cities controlled by big companies are old hat in science fiction. The company city subgenre always seems to star a hero who outsmarted, overthrew, or escaped the company. I've never seen one where the hero fought like hell to get taken in and underpaid by the company. In real life, that's the way it will be. That's the way it is.
Yeah, I picked up on that. She frequently mentioned like in 20th century and 19th century science fiction novels. So it's like very self-aware that she's referencing this, but also using the same, some of the same mechanisms in her own story.
Yeah, I didn't really know what to make of that. I felt like she was deliberately, that is Octavia Butler, deliberately popping the hood, you know, and be like, hey, you know, this is how usually these stories run, but that's not how this is gonna go. Like, this is just, and I wasn't sure what to make of that, because I don't read widely in the genre. Just kind of, I read that and thought, huh, okay, like, you know, this is the author maybe making a statement about the quality of other science fiction, perhaps, or maybe like just placing like a mark on the board saying like, okay, like this is how it used to go, and but that's not very satisfying, and I'm setting out deliberately to write a different story.
I also think when she has like when Octavia Butler is talking about science fiction in this book, it kind of like it blurs the line a little bit, or it makes you think about like, well, where does life actually look like science fiction, or what, you know, I mean, like this is supposed to be the future and dystopian, but we all read this now and we're like, yeah, we see this, you know. So I think it's, and I don't know if she was doing that intentionally, but it does make you think about like what could seem like science fiction to some people might seem like reality to others.
I mean, you reminded me of something that I read about her when she was saying that when she was growing, like her mother scrapped really hard to support her and to do, and to like provide her like a typewriter and to do all this stuff. And at one point she had said something, I don't know if I'm getting the details right, but the larger paintbrush strokes are correct. She had said something to her mother that was like, I don't want to do what you're doing. You know, and she saw that it really hurt her mother, and then it like reframed the way that she was able to see like what it was that her mother was doing for her. And so I think that like this question makes me think about that, right? Because, you know, what people are willing to do and what people are willing to scrap for looks totally different based on your position, right? Like if you're working some job that you like took specific steps to work toward, you think work looks a certain way, right? Like if you've got a child and your husband died and you have limited access to this, that, and the other, the job you can get, like that feels very different, right? Like that pathway for the next person. One pathway for like the next generation is somebody else's, like, I couldn't even imagine doing this terrible, terrible thing, right? There's something I read on Twitter actually 2 days ago or yesterday that reminds me of this as well. Like there was somebody who was saying like, I am flabbergasted by people who are ashamed to be descended from slaves. And I think that that's similar, right? Because like some people will see like, okay, this is where I am now, and I can't believe that these people did this. And other people will see like this, like, wow, I'm really descended from people who were scrappy as all get out and were survivors and made it possible for me to even be alive, right? And I think that like how you're positioned and how you think and what your experiences are definitely impact the way that you look at these things, right? And so like she comes from this background where she's seen people scrap, right? She comes from this background, this writerly background, where she would just go to work all day, and she like intentionally worked a job where she's like, all right, I'm gonna keep my mind loose and free, I'm gonna work, and then I'm gonna go write, right? So like her perspective in developing this work, I think, is extremely informed by the things that she experienced and the things that she saw.
I picked up on that a little bit, that theme of like Lauren not having much experience outside. And whenever she went outside, she like looked down on everyone out there. Like she had empathy because of her hyper empathy, but like I feel like her emotional empathy wasn't there. And then later she has to go out there and adapt to that world, and she starts feeling a lot of actual real empathy and connection with people who have had really hard backgrounds, that she may have looked at them before as a child and just been like, ew, that person's gross and scary, like I don't want anything to do with that, because she'd never ever seen it before. Or if she had, it was like, the kids are supposed to look down, they're not supposed to look around them at all when they're going out to do target practice, is when she would see that. Or when she went to get baptized, I think was another scene where she described it.
Yeah, I think there's a growing awareness throughout the book of like the idea of like legacy, like what you're leaving to your children and like what you're teaching your children. And I think that's part of it. Like you survive, like she's trying to make a world where being like people have the ability not to go to a company town to support their children, basically. So I think, because I think that Octavia Butler really like writes about people, and I think it is a real human drive to like support, to like seek safety and like try and support your children if you have them, because so many of the more conservative characters I think have, or like conservative in like the risks they're willing to take is what I mean. It's because they have children and they're like they feel like putting themselves out there is harder.
Definitely. So much of science fiction is just extrapolating what will happen or what could happen if a certain thing happened, just because you were thinking about safety. And I know that Octavia Butler, in interviews about it, was fairly cynical about history. She saw it very cyclically. She knew that social progress was reversible, and that as things were lost, that fear of change would kind of open up this opportunity for retrograde politics, and with collapse, racism would become more overt. And you kind of see that play out in who she chooses as her traveling companions, that they're pretty much all people of color or mixed race, or are in interracial relationships, that it definitely feels like a safer space than traveling with white people, basically. If anybody else had any thoughts about how those things showed up in the novel.
I read that differently. I read it as sort of she's on the road once her community collapses, her neighborhood collapses, and most everyone's killed. She is at the mercy of the outside world, and I didn't get that sense that she was deliberately seeking out people of color, so much as I was getting the sense that she had her eyes wide open for people who, she was open to this idea that, you know, you don't get to choose the people you ride with out here, but you can find kindred spirits, and you can maybe turn people over to your way of thinking, and maybe find some fellow travelers. And I felt like there was a lot of, that was one of my favorite parts of this book, quite honestly, was every time Lauren's band of people grew, and she I don't want to use the word like conscripted, but she sort of invited people in and sort of took measure of her fellow travelers, of people who are on the road, you know, fleeing, whatever. And I think that lesson is potentially a pretty deep one, that you don't, I mean, we like to think of ourselves, and then back to the prepper mentality, right? Where you get to shape your narrative, and, you know, you control, you have agency in the midst of great chaos. Well, what if you don't? You know, what happens if you lose the people, your friends, you know, your compatriots, and your awesome community that you've built is burned to the ground? I mean, these are really, you know, deep questions, I think. And Lauren's character here, it seems like her answer is, well, like, you just have to keep moving. You just need to find, as best you can, people who will be receptive, and they may be at first antagonistic. They may, I think of her, you know, her religion, Earthseed, and I think about how a lot of people along her journey are very, you know, either skeptical, open, or either outright hostile to that, this idea of religion and what Earthseed represents, and pushing back on it. Even her love interest in this story is kind of, he meets that this worldview, which is incredibly important to Lauren, with a little bit of like bemused skepticism. It seems like, oh, okay, sure, like go ahead, yeah, that's fine. Like, my ex-wife also decided to believe in God, and it was fine. Like, I showed up to church service, but, you know, like, she works very hard at I guess, like, seedings, for lack of a better word, like the conversation she's having with it, with her fellow travelers. And I thought that was so fascinating, how she won some people over, and she wasn't, I think, dumb. Like, she was very deliberate about it, and she knew that, okay, it seems like she's constantly kind of assessing, is this person my ally or not, or like, this person has potential, I'm going to be patient with him or her because they seem like they might be worth it. I just love to get that in her head, because she's so scrappy, intelligent, and I mean, she's dedicated to her idea. I think her notion of not just creating a safe space for people to live outside of, you know, the company store, but like going to the stars. Like, her religion really is driving her in that way, which is interesting.
I want to return to like the part of the question where it was noticed that a lot of the people that were in her group were mixed race people and people of color, I think. And but I think that she was able to see who might be the most receptive, right? Like, I think that like the experiences that she had, because we see a lot of evidence in the book for a lot of awareness of how circumstances may be different for people of different races. We see that when they decide to travel together, and they're making very deliberate decisions about like how they will be responded to as a group. We also see a lot, I feel like throughout the book, there's a lot of specific recognition of the dangers that women face in this world, right? So I feel like one of the baseline ideas is this, is the fact that different folks face different dangers. And if you're facing a whole different set of dangers, then you may know that you're better off to try to band together with people, or you may play your cards differently, right? Because you're like, all right, I got 27 dangers. Maybe these weirdos are a good bet for me, right? And we saw that there were people with children as well. That's another circumstance that will quickly show you that it's better to band together than it is to try to forge out alone as a unit. Like children require a lot. They make a lot of noise. It's a lot of vulnerability. And so I definitely think that while she was able to convince different people from different points of view, they all had something that would have made them feel like they may be better with a group of people, as opposed to feeling like they would be better off by keeping everybody out.
I had made a note at one point that they were talking about Harry's whiteness, and it's like a currency for them as a group. But I mean, for him, obviously it's a currency for him, but like in the group setting, they use that to their advantage. But like, it's something that he's not aware of, but the group is aware of. Like one of the women was telling him, you could go manage indebted wage laborers and be their driver. And he's like, what's that? Like he has no idea. Like he's a white man, he can go do that. And everyone else is like, okay then, like you don't know what's going on, obviously. But he chooses to stay with the group. But his case is kind of one where it's like, what is he really getting out of the whole situation?
I was also thinking it was strategic in ways that not only people who would maybe be receptive or be willing to join them, but that it also seemed like these people were among the most marginalized groups of like the mixed race family. They were going to be a target because of that. And so it's like they're seen as kind of like a safe choice of like, there's always the risk of someone being a thief or a murderer, right? Which is recognized pretty often, but there's not the same like fear of those people.
That's funny too, like when she first set off with Zara and Harry, it was like Harry was the one that needed the most convincing of the whole idea. Like Zara was like, yeah, no, this is what we have to do now. I know about this. This is something I've experienced. Lauren was like, I haven't experienced it, but I know it's the way to go. And he was just like, I don't really know, I don't know if I can trust you guys and all of this stuff. And he just kind of didn't have the awareness that the others did. And it kind of continued on.
So something that we haven't really talked about too much is her hyper empathy, which is probably the most like fantastical detail that's included in this book. And I was wondering what you guys felt about like how important this was for the novel. What would it have been like without this detail? Like, why do you think this was such an important thing that Butler included?
I think it's really interesting that it's a product of drug abuse. I think that that's obviously important. It makes me think a lot of different things about, I would be open to hearing what other people thought about that too. Yeah,
it struck me as interesting that it's a weakness, because in fact, in this day and age, I think it's very, popular to try to cultivate empathy, right? And then here is someone who got this and doesn't like it, and at every moment, like every turn, she's trying to conceal it from people because people will exploit it, as her brother does. And it's just, I found that to be really interesting too, like do you really want to be empathetic? How empathetic?
See, and I couldn't read this without thinking, I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead. Go.
I cannot read about hyper empathy without thinking about the emotional labor that is expected of women oftentimes and many times, of other minorities, to take on like the responsibility to like help other people see this, that, and the other, right? And that's like, if you told me that she wasn't thinking about that, I just wouldn't believe you. Even if you had documentary evidence, I think she was lying in her documentary evidence, because it felt extremely like, I understand exactly why you wouldn't want that, to just at any point have like this burden of somebody else's feelings put upon you. And once it's put upon you, there's nothing you could do about it but like suffer through it.
I think the gendered aspect of it is interesting. And I think Octavia Butler touches on it briefly when she finds out that one of their companion's sons had it, and she's like, oh wow, I never even considered a boy having it before. What would that even look like?
I think it's also interesting that it can be that it's dangerous for her a lot of times in the world that she's living in now, like outside the wall, because she has to be really careful about who she defends and defending herself, because, you know, because of that hyper empathy, like she's delivering those blows to herself as well. And so I thought that was I just thought that was interesting. That's something that like could be like also gave her this sort of, I think, unique vision, you know, like for people's feelings, and kind of why we need to create a new humanity was also dangerous for her and could incapacitate her pretty quickly.
It's clear too that it is part of what makes her a good leader, is because she's had like a lifetime of having to study people and whether or not she can trust somebody and whether or not she can, like, I don't know, because she's always vulnerable, you know, how vulnerable she can be with people. So it puts her on this high alert. And you can, I mean, the whole novel, right? Like you were saying, Audrey, like Octavia Butler writes people, like this is my first Octavia Butler experience. It's incredible. And she's just constantly like, okay, so this person has this thing going on, and this is why they're an asset, and this is what's going to be hard for us to deal with, and all of that. And it's just like she's constantly aware of all of their, you know, strengths and weaknesses, basically.
I think one
I
of the
also-
important things about hyperempathy is also that it is indiscriminate. Like it applies to everybody. She can't turn it on or off or extend it to people that she chooses to extend it to. She just has to have she potentially can have this experience with anybody. And I think that is a really, I have a half-formed idea around this, but I think that's part of what's going on in my brain with it, is like, she just has to deal with it, right? And we, with our empathy, we can choose who we extend it to, and she can't.
I also think that word choice is interesting, that she calls her condition being a sharer. And later on, the other man with it calls it just like being a feeler. Like he didn't call it being a sharer, which I thought was like an interesting distinction between how the man with the same condition conceived of it versus how she did. I also think it's interesting, the kind of, I think Elizabeth mentioned this earlier, of like, she has this condition that makes her like literally feel other people's pain in a very like real physical sense. But sometimes she seems in her actions to be more like cold and calculating. And I haven't read any of the Parable of the Talents yet. So I don't remember if this is from that book or from one of the other notes about the series that she made, but they're talking about how it was from the point of view of one of her descendants who viewed Lauren as this like cold, calculating religious zealot, which I think is so interesting compared to like how we know her in this book.
Fun fact, Earthseed is a real religion. They have a whole, you know, internet presence, and I don't know how many people are actually members of it. But when she was interviewed about people actually taking up Earthseed as a living spiritual practice, she was surprised and dismissive because she couldn't imagine Earthseed as a comforting religion. And I think like she wasn't actually, maybe, you know, she wasn't actually trying to create a religion. It's sort of, you know, it's like, it's a really important tool for Lauren, and she wants to share the tool. And maybe being hyper empathetic is something that, you know, like she just has to be a little bit more pragmatic about things, or like that coldness, I guess, is a part of her being. I don't know. I thought that was fascinating that people are actually Earthseed folks, Earthseed believers.
I think that that's a very interesting idea, like the thought of her being perceived as very cold, because sometimes I think of that, like when we think about what it means to be kind, or what we think it means to be careful, or what we think it means to be things like that. like we almost put it in a certain set of clothing, and things that aren't wearing that clothing are not perceived to be kind, even if it may be, right? You know, like this is a gross example and probably not a very good one, but like if there's an animal that is clearly ailing, it's clearly gonna die. Is it cold to kill it, or is it kind to kill it, right? And there are certain behaviors that I think it's harder for us to accept as kindness, because we expect kindness or care to look in a certain way, but sometimes the behaviors that are perceived as kind are the mean ones. And, an example of that is like, you're talking with a friend, they're wrong. Their decisions are going to lead them somewhere terrible, but you're trying to be nice in the way that you're talking with them about it. Like, is that kind? It feels kind to you. It feels kind to them. But like, if they're unable to see something that you can see, is it the kind thing to leave them blind? Question mark. Like, I think that some people would say it is, and I think that some people would say it isn't. And I think that that's one of these ideas behind like seeing her here in her hyper empathy and seeing her read as cold and calculating somewhere else.
Yeah, I think this comes up between Lauren and the other character, Harry, at a couple of points in the narrative where I think Harry's always like, he's just like completely gobsmacked, not by the news that Lauren is a sharer, but just like how she seems completely different to him upon, the dissolution, the complete attack and destruction on their community. And when they're out on the road, he's like, I don't even know who you are, right? He's just completely blown away by her. And there's a moment when she does indeed need to, like, I think mercifully kill someone and Harry can't believe it, just will not. It's hard for him to read that as kindness or the right thing to do, right? The just thing to do. And then when Lauren, the way that she holds her sharing as a secret, and she knows that she must disclose it at some point to those who are, riding with her, is also like, it's interesting that it just, I don't know, it can't. I think of kindness, and like Charlene was just talking about, we see it in a particular way a lot of times, and like, and it may not be as simple and as visible and as immutable as one is led to believe. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, it makes me like, I'm not really sure, what this complete idea is, but like Shalana, you were talking about kindness and care, but it's almost as if caregiving is the opposite of kindness in a lot of ways. Like, in order to provide care, you might have to be unkind, but we always put those two words together. And there are a lot of examples, like, but they were talking about, killing, like mercifully killing someone, you're providing them with care. We just don't think of it that way because we always put care and kindness together.
So much of the book is about change, and Earthseed is like her religion that she's creating, and there's kind of a lot of embedded power in that, of like that we can be responsible for shaping our own future, and we can shape what we want. And kind of Lauren's goal is sort of like to build a new community, and in the midst of all of the like chaos in the world, the only other like actors that we really see glimpses of are the pyromaniacs, who like are obviously like drug cult, semi loose group of people acting individually but sort of together. And it's sort of like that they're almost combating wealth, that they're sort of like, they see themselves maybe as like Robin Hood types in a way. They burn down to like take away from people who have things. I don't know, it was like a half-formed thought. I don't know if anybody else had any other thoughts about the role of fire or that other group in this book. I know that was really broad.
I mean, a quick point about fire is that it's also just like uncontrollable. There's nothing, kind of like the hyper empathy. It's just like that applies to everybody indiscriminately. And no matter who, is in the line of fire, they're gonna, get burned basically. And I think this ties in, I mean, what we've been talking about a lot is cold and kindness, and it's very animalistic, like we're kind of in our sort of cleaned up modern society, maybe we're like pretty dissociated with the plain facts of life and death. And the fact that she can, she has to kill people so that she can't feel the pain, so she can keep her folks alive, like that's survival, and that's where they're at. And it's kind of, I don't know, I think there's definitely themes about survival and being human animals versus, kind of being kind or glossing over things when you have to just be practical. But I don't know if I added or to the fire thought, but.
Part of me had wondered if it was an intentional critique. This was published right after the Rodney King riots. And I was wondering if this was sort of a commentary of like people doing more harm than good. And I have no idea her intent on that.
Yeah, I would think of like the fire obviously has a lot of different value, like symbolic values throughout the book, but I think one of them is related to the climate change that kind of underscores all these disasters. And I think at the time this was written, it was like when forest fires out in the West were starting to get bad, and now here we are in 2022 and they're still very bad. And one of the main themes was also like the lack of water. So when there are these fires, there's no way to put them out, literally and metaphorically. And so yeah, I just feel like that's really like tied into the climate change, and like Andrew said, like we have no power to stop it. It's out of control, and it's not going to be stopped because it's a natural force that we now have no power to control. If we ever did, if we ever had the illusion that we did.
You made me think, like maybe that's the part of that is like the hand of being a California writer. You know what I mean? Like your proximity to like the danger of fire is present in a way that it's not necessarily for, someone in the Great Lakes state.
Yeah, in the sense of drought, like that's something that a lot of us wouldn't be able to relate to. But I remember when I was in grad school in like 2013, 2014, there was an artist that came and she was doing a lot of like apocalyptic videos set in California, and it was all about how there's no water. And at that time there was a severe drought and it hadn't rained in like a year or something. So yeah, I think it might be different for someone living out in that area reading this and responding to it than us in the Great Lakes, where we're like, how could you ever not have water? It's crazy. There's water everywhere.
We're approaching our time, so I wanted to open it up if anybody else had any other burning thoughts or ideas that bubbled up for you about this book that I didn't ask about.
I'm struggling to remember Lauren's lover's name. If someone could help me out, but I just finished it. But I was really curious about the fact that like their age difference, I guess, like there's a big generational gap, like a couple generations of a gap. And I wondered what anybody thought about why she did that. Because in some way, I was sort of frustrated by it. I think like young women and old men is a trope that I don't need to see more of necessarily. And I think that that's just funny because that's like very personal like opinion about it. But I'm sure that she did that for a very good multiple reasons. And I think it's important that it incited that in me because obviously, I had feelings about it. I thought it was wonderful, their relationship, but be curious to hear other people's thoughts about it.
I do think it's interesting that she kind of like criticized, or like not criticized, but spent some time talking about other young girls that had been in relationships with older men and like kind of looking down on it. And then, but in her situation, it was different because she chose it.
Mhm.
Wonder, she is a very unusual person, you know, and I think that youth is not kind to unusual people. And I think that if you're like very unusual, and I don't know how like apocalypse impacts these dynamics, but I think that if you're a young person who is like, especially as young as she is, who's very unusual, and she has like this hyper empathic thing as well, I would have a hard time imagining her in a relationship with anyone anywhere near her age, because I just have a hard time imagining that happening for her with her circumstances. But like, I like a May December romance. Like, I had never read this before, and I was like, if I'd have known this storyline was in there, I'd have read this book years ago. So I'm kind of like on the other side of that. But I do think it's gross sometimes, like the way that we experience like that age difference in a lot of media. I think a lot of time it's super predatory. I think there's a lot of like social dynamics in it. I think that more times than not, in real life, there's some kind of like power going on in there. And I do think that a lot of times it's super gross, but here that wasn't the case. And like I said, I can't imagine her being able to like connect well with someone her own age.
Totally.
Yeah, definitely. I think the fact that Lauren has conviction and the strength of and intelligence that she has, like it felt like parity between these people of very disparate ages. And Benkol is the man's name, and he can't believe how young she is because I think that shows like her comportment, right? And how that's I second that feeling of like it's hard to imagine somebody like Lauren being involved in a long term or in a deep way with somebody close to her age, 18. But I haven't read a lot of Octavia Butler, but I have it on good authority that Octavia Butler has played with this age disparity in other books of hers as well. Adrienne Marie Brown was the one who said, yeah, there's something here, like about this age disparity, because it comes up again and again with Octavia Butler. But yeah,
I mean, I think there's also something just to be said that he is of a previous generation, so he does have these memories of what it used to be like. And so him coupling with her, this like new generation, is sort of like bringing it into the future. Hopefully, maybe there's some, I don't know, connection there. But
I think it was also tempered by the fact that we saw her actual relationship with her dad and that they had a good relationship. Because I also similarly kind of bristle sometimes at these like very old men and young women.
yeah.
And even though in this case, like it makes a lot of
Oh darn.
bad.
We needed that thought. You froze a little bit.
Yeah. Where did I freeze?
Right at the good, you had just like set up your thought and we're getting into it.
It was in there somewhere. It was good that she had a good relationship with her dad, because I also bristle at like old men and young women, and it made sense in this case, like knowing her personality and her everything about this. So it felt a little gross knowing that like she didn't have like daddy issues, which I hate that word, but
Rough.
yeah. All right, if no one else has any thoughts, I'll leave it with a favorite question to end on is, what other media were you thinking about when you read this? What does this make you want to read more of? Do you think you'll read the next in the series if you haven't already?
I already requested Parable of the Talents, so it's on the hold shelf.
I think it's being made into, or it's been optioned to be a TV series, which will be interesting to see how it translates into that.
I don't know. I mean, it's always compared to like 1984 and all of these kind of, I mean, books that were written quite a long time ago. And then there's Parable of the Sower. And I'm sure there's something in between there that I would love to read. And I'd love to read more like this. That's more up, you know, like, I mean, the thing about it is that it sort of transcends time because it is cyclical, but definitely so relatable. As 1984 was when I read it as a teenager, but this is just like, it hits so hard, so relevant.
Yeah, I don't know if it makes me want to read anything more. I'm a little scared to read like the second book in this trilogy, to be honest. Like, I'm aware that Octavia Butler tried to write a third, and it was not for lack of trying that the third book did not get written. You know what I mean? Like, it was just, it is heavy. Like, this book was heavy, and I hear that Parable of the Talents is harder. And so, like, talk about staring into the abyss, right? Like, more than reading another book, it kind of makes me want to pack a go bag. But I mean, yeah, like, it's, I think that, you know, but you mentioned, somebody mentioned that there's actual like religion. Yeah, Angie mentioned that there's like a religion around Earthseed. And I think that like people can take this book seriously. I can see how one would really like take what is written here very seriously and personally.
There's
I'll
a,
just-
sorry.
Sorry. I'll just throw out that I was thinking about The Power when I read this. I don't know if anyone else read that. It was a more recent book that kind of had like an interesting take on like history and the cyclical nature of history. So I was thinking about that, and then I'm just gonna say I'll read The Parable of the Talents next. Sorry, Shalanya.
No, don't be. There was a podcast that someone who made a musical out of this worked on with someone else. I can't remember her name right now. And I kind of want to listen to that podcast because they had a lot of interesting, I listened to part of it, but not all of it, but they had a lot of interesting conversations. But when I was reading this several months ago, I was reading it at the same time as reading a lot about Martin Luther King. And so like these two are like mashed together. You know, that happens in your mind sometimes, like if you're reading multiple things, it's just like this sandwich that you can't pull the peanut butter off of the jelly and the jelly off of the peanut butter. And that's kind of, I wonder how that impacts the way that, I wonder how those things impact the way that we take in something like this that seems so tangible today. Because I can't imagine, you know, upon thinking about that, I can't imagine reading many, I can imagine that most anything that you could be reading or consuming while you're consuming this would remind you of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll recommend everybody to read this book by Evie Zaboy. It's kind of a semi-biographical. There's a lot of like poetry. They call it a biographical constellation of Octavia Butler. Star Child, I didn't even say the title. It's here. I enjoyed this quite a bit. So now,
yeah, I just read that one too, and
yeah.
I think a lot of times like biographical material that's written for a younger audience, I think as an adult I get a lot out of that because it can be presented like the way it's presented in that book is so interesting, and the way that the author writes her own poetry in there, I really liked it.
There's also so much like context for her work that I really appreciated more than I thought I would, just about like things that she experienced growing up. Like you really see it in her work, which I enjoy.